Hello and welcome back to Rabbit Reads, where we are on the second to last chapter of Skulduggery Pleasant, which this chapter is entitled Deep in Dublin, Death. The White Cleaver stood there, silent as a ghost, deadly as a plague. "Valkyrie," Tana said, "get behind me." Stephanie backed up until she was beside Skulduggery. "I'll hold him off," Tana said. "You stop Serpine." She drew her sword. The cleaver drew his scythe. Stephanie felt Skulduggery touch her arm, and they moved. "You're going to have to go after the scepter," Skulduggery whispered as they jogged through the corridor. "You can get close to it. I can't. It's not much of a plan, but sometimes simplicity is the way to go." The repository was just ahead. They slowed, and Skulduggery gripped both her arms and turned to her. "But you listen to me. If it goes wrong, if we lose the element of surprise, I want you to get out of here, no matter what happens to me. I want you to run. Do you understand?" Stephanie swallowed. "Yes." He hesitated. "Serpine used my wife and child as a weapon against me. In order to do so, he had to kill them. He took my family's death and he made it about me. Valkyrie, when you die, it will be your death and yours alone. Let it come to you on your own terms." She nodded. "Valkyrie Kane," he said, "it has been an absolute pleasure knowing you." She looked back at him. "You too." If he had lips, she knew he'd be smiling. They sneaked up to the doors. They were already open, and Stephanie could see Serpine, the scepter in his hand, and his back to them, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the book of names. Sagacious Tome was watching, but he too had his back to the doors. "I can't see Mr. Bliss," Stephanie whispered, and Skulduggery shook his head. Neither could he. Stephanie hesitated, then passed into the repository and crept to her left. She reached a heavy table laden with artifacts and peered around. Serpine had stopped walking, and for a moment she thought he knew she was there. But as she watched, he turned and walked back, shaking his head. "It's still too strong," he said. "It's weak as it's going to get," Sagacious Tome said. "I thought with Meritorious and Morwena dead, the barrier wouldn't pose a problem. But I can't withdraw my contribution to the spell, not without the others joining me in the ceremony." Serpine rejoined Tome, arching a brow. "Then perhaps we shouldn't have killed them." "I didn't kill them," Tome said defensively. "You did." Stephanie stayed low as she crept from behind the table. Serpine laughed. "I may have been the one to turn them to dust, but you set them up, Sagacious. You drew them in. You betrayed them." Tome spun on Serpine, jabbing at the space between them with his fingers. "No, I didn't. It was their weakness that led to their downfall. Their own shortcomings. They had all this power, and they were satisfied to just sit there and let it all go to waste." "Until recently, I'd never thought about your ambitions." "No one had. Sagacious Tome, they said. He's a non-entity. He's not the strongest, he's not the wisest, he's nothing. That's what they said. I know it. For years, people have been underestimating me. It's time people recognized my power." Stephanie got to her hands and knees and started crawling. She was in shadow, and they weren't looking her way. But if either turned, there was a chance they would see her. Stephanie wasn't in the mood to take any chances. "I'm going to make them pay," Tome was saying. "Everyone who ever questioned me. The streets will run red with their blood." "How dramatic," Serpine said and raised his hand. Stephanie saw the book lift off its pedestal and hover there for a moment. Then he grunted impatiently and let it drop again. "I told you, that's not going to work," Tom said. "It's how close you are getting it. It doesn't have to be physically close. It isn't a physical barrier. It's a mental barrier." Stephanie held her breath. She was behind the pillar next to them. Serpine's voice was so close he could have been speaking right into her ear. "So with you, the final elder remaining, the barrier isn't sufficiently weakened to let me through. Is that right?" "Yes, but that's not my fault. I did what I could." "Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And now there's one more thing you can do to help solve this little problem." "What are you talking about?" Tom asked, and then his tone changed, suddenly becoming afraid. "What are you doing? Point that thing somewhere else, Serpine. I'm warning you. Point that... There was a black flash and silence. After a moment, she heard Serpine's footsteps move off again. Stephanie took a peek. He was walking slowly, concentrating on the book, his back to her. This was the only chance he was going to get. She crept out from behind the pillar, ignoring the fresh pile of dust at her feet. There was no way she could close the distance without giving herself away. He'd hear her, sense her, whatever. But he was holding the scepter in his hand so loosely. Stephanie narrowed her eyes and stepped forward. He had heard her and was turning, but she didn't care. The scepter was coming up, the black crystal starting to glow. She flexed her fingers and splayed her hand, snapping open her palm, pushing at the air, and the space around her hand rippled, and the scepter flew from Serpine's grasp, flew away from them both, and hit the far wall. Serpine hissed in anger and turned. They heard the scepter start to sing as Skulduggery sprinted in. He dived into the air, and the space around him shimmered as he shot forward. He covered the distance in the blink of an eye. He crashed into Serpine, taking him off his feet. They hit the pedestal, and it toppled, the book falling as they sprawled onto the ground. Skulduggery was the first to stand, and he hauled Serpine up, shoved him against a pillar, and fired off a punch that jerked his head back. Serpine lunged, but Skulduggery snagged his wrist and stepped in, and then under the arm. He turned and wrenched, and Serpine yelled in pain as a loud crack echoed through the chamber. Serpine tried gathering purple vapor in his hand, but Skulduggery batted the hand away, chopped it into the side of his neck. Serpine gagged and dropped back, and Skulduggery kicked his legs out from under him. "You're never going to fight worth anything," Skulduggery said, standing over him. "But then you didn't need to, did you? Not when you had lackeys to do your fighting for you. Where are your lackeys now, Nefarian?" "I don't need them," Serpine muttered. "I don't need anyone. I'll crush you myself. Grind your bones to dust." Skulduggery tilted his head. "Unless you've got an army tucked away in that fancy coat of yours, I sincerely doubt it." Serpine scrambled up and rushed at him, but Skulduggery drove in a kick and brought his closed fist down onto his shoulder, and Serpine fell to his knees. Stephanie had to get to the scepter before Serpine recovered. She was pushing herself off the ground when she realized the book of names was lying open right beside her. She glanced at the page, and the columns of names started to rearrange themselves before her eyes. She saw her own name written there, but she looked up when she heard Skulduggery grunt. Serpine was on his knees, but his lips were moving, and the wall behind Skulduggery came alive, with hands that reached out and grabbed him. Skulduggery was pulled back, and Serpine stood. There were a series of dull cracks and pops as Serpine's broken bones mended and realigned. "Where are your oh-so-clever taunts now, detective?" Skulduggery struggled against the grip of a dozen hands. "You've got big ears," he managed to say before he was pulled even further back into the wall, and then he was gone. Serpine looked over, saw Stephanie, saw how close she was to the scepter. He snapped out his hand, and a thin purple tendril whipped out towards the scepter. He pulled his arm back, and the scepter flew off the ground, but Stephanie lunged and managed to grab it. She was jerked off her feet, but her grip was strong, and the tendril broke, becoming vapor, and she hit the floor. She heard a crash and looked around as a table hurtled straight at her. She tried to dive out of the way, but she wasn't quick enough. It hit her, and she screamed, dropped the scepter, and clutched at her broken leg. She shut her eyes against the tears of pain, and when she opened them again, Mr. Bliss was walking into the room.
"Where have you been?"
Sir Pine snapped. "I was delayed," Mr. Bliss answered, "but you seem to have done fine without me." Sir Pine narrowed his eyes.
"Indeed. Still, there's one more adversary to deal with."
Mr. Bliss looked at Stephanie. "You're going to kill her?"
"Me? No. You are."
"I'm sorry."
"If you want to reap the rewards of this night, you have to get your hands a little bloody."
"You want me to kill an unarmed child?" Mr. Bliss asked doubtfully.
"Look on it as a test of your commitment to our lords and masters. You don't have a problem with that, do you?"
Mr. Bliss looked at him coolly. "Do you have a weapon for me, or do you just want me to beat her to death with a large stick?" Sir Pine took a dagger from his coat and lobbed it over to him. Mr. Bliss snatched it out of the air and held it, testing its weight. Stephanie felt her throat go dry. Mr. Bliss looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just sighed and hurled the dagger, and Stephanie made a face and turned her head, and heard Sir Pine laugh. She looked. The dagger hadn't touched her. It hadn't even come close. It was in Sir Pine's hand. He had caught it before it had sliced into her glittering left eye.
"I thought as much,"
Sir Pine said. Mr. Bliss flung himself at Sir Pine, but Sir Pine ripped his glove off and raised his red right hand, and Mr. Bliss collapsed. Sir Pine listened to him scream for a few moments before dropping his hand, and Mr. Bliss gasped.
"No doubt you want to kill me."
Sir Pine said as he approached him.
"No doubt you want to rip me limb from limb, and with your legendary strength, I know you could do it, and not even exert yourself. But answer me this, Mr. Bliss. What good is legendary strength when you can't get close enough to use it?"
Mr. Bliss tried to stand, but his knees gave out, and he hit the ground again.
"I'm curious," Sir Pine continued. "Why the pretense? Why go to all this trouble? Why put yourself in this position? Why didn't you just stick with the detective?"
Mr. Bliss managed to shake his head. "We might have been able to stop you," he said. "I know you, Sir Pine. You always have a plan to fall back on. You were too dangerous, too unpredictable. I needed you to get to the scepter." Sir Pine smiled.
"And why was that?"
Mr. Bliss echoed that smile with one of his own, albeit a bit drained and sickly version. "Because once you had the scepter, I could predict your actions."
"So you predicted my invulnerability?"
Sir Pine laughed.
"Oh, well done."
"No one's invulnerable," Mr. Bliss whispered.
"Yes, well,"
Sir Pine said with a shrug.
"You're certainly not."
Stephanie watched in horror as Sir Pine again pointed his red right hand, and Mr. Bliss contorted in agony. His screams reached new heights, and just when it seemed like he could take no more, Sir Pine picked him up and with his hands pressed against him, gathering the purple vapor in his fist, Mr. Bliss was blasted backwards through the air into a group of shelves at the far side of the room. He didn't get up. Sir Pine turned back to Stephanie.
"Sorry for the interruption,"
he said as he picked her up. His hand gripped the lapels of her coat, and he lifted her off her feet. Looking up at her as he spoke, her right leg dangled uselessly, and that pain was all she felt.
How did you do it? How did you get so close without the scepter alerting me? Some magic I don't know about?
Stephanie didn't answer.
Miss Kane, I know you're trying to hide it, but I can see the fear in your eyes. You don't want to die today, do you? Of course you don't. You have your whole life ahead of you. If only you'd keep out of all of this. If only you'd left the death of your uncle alone, you wouldn't be here right now. Your uncle was a very stubborn man. If he had just given me the key when I asked him, you wouldn't be in this predicament. He delayed my plans, you see. Caused a lot of unnecessary stress and bother. A lot of people are dead now because of him.
Stephanie's face twisted. Don't you dare blame my uncle for the people you've killed.
I didn't want this. I didn't want conflict. I just wanted to eliminate the elders and take the book. Do you see how simple that would have been? Instead, I've had to wade through a river of corpses. Those deaths are on your uncle's head.
Stephanie's hatred became a cold thing in her century.
But you don't have to join them, Miss Kane. You can survive this. You can live. I see something in you. I think you'd like the new world that's coming.
I wouldn't bet on it, Stephanie said quietly. Serpine smiled patiently and leaned his face in close to her.
You can survive. If you tell me how you got so close without the scepter alerting me.
With no weapons left, Stephanie spat on him. He sighed and threw her against a pillar. She smacked into it, and her body twisted, and she dropped to her back. Her eyes wouldn't focus. The pain was far away. She heard his voice like there was a wall separating them.
No matter. I'm about to make slaves of the entire population of this planet. And then there will be no more secrets. There will be no more magic hidden from me. And when the Faceless Ones return, this world will be remade as a place of splendid darkness.
He passed her, a vague shape in the corner of her eye. She had to get up. She had to snap out of this. The pain from her broken leg. She had to let it in. It was nothing more than a sensation now. She had to allow it to flood her. She focused on her leg. It was throbbing, the pain spiking, and with each new height it reached, her mind sharpened a little more. Then the pain came at her, cascaded over her with its full force, and she had to bite her lip to stop from crying out. She looked up. Serpine was approaching the book. Stephanie gripped the edge of the tabletop and pulled herself up onto her good leg. She grabbed the first thing she saw, a glass vial filled with green liquid. She threw it. It hit Serpine in the back and shattered, and the liquid turned to vapor and dissipated into the air. He spun around angrily.
You, my dear, have proven yourself to be far too troublesome for your own good.
He raised his red hand. And from somewhere behind her, she heard the scepter singing again. And then Skulduggery dropped through the ceiling, landing in a heap next to Serpine. The detective looked around. Ah, he said. I'm back.
You are,
Serpine said, and Skulduggery looked up and saw him. Serpine lashed a kick into Skulduggery's side, and Skulduggery grunted. He tried to get up, but Serpine batted his hands away and grabbed his skull. He drove his knee into the side of Skulduggery's head, and Skulduggery sprawled onto his back. Serpine looked over to Stephanie and then to the ground behind her. She turned, saw the scepter. She lunged for it, but a purple tendril wrapped itself around her waist, and she was yanked back onto her broken leg. She cried out as the pain shot through her. Serpine whipped the tendril to the scepter, yanked it into his left hand, and whirled, the crystal flashing with a black light that straight toward Skulduggery. The detective dived as a whole section of the wall behind him turned to dust. Skulduggery drew his gun and fired, hitting Serpine in the chest.
"Still with that little toy of yours,"
Serpine said, amused and unharmed.
"How quaint."
Skulduggery circled him. Serpine held the scepter down by his side. "You'll be stopped," Skulduggery said. "You've always been stopped."
"Oh, my old foe. But this is different. Those days are gone. Who is there to rise up against me? Who is left? Remember when you were a man? A real man? I mean, not this mockery I see before me. Do you remember what it was like? You had an army on your side. You had people willing to fight and die for your cause. We wanted to bring the faceless ones back, to worship them as the gods that they are. You wanted to keep them out, so that this infestation of humanity, this celebration of the mundane, might be allowed to live and thrive. Well, they've lived, and they've thrived, and now their time is up."
Skulduggery's fingers tightened around the trigger. Black blood sprayed from Serpine's chest, and the wound instantly healed. Serpine laughed.
"You have caused me so much trouble over the years, Detective. It's almost a shame that I have to end it."
Skulduggery cocked his head. "You're surrendering?"
"I'm going to miss this," Serpine said. "If it makes it any easier, you can think your imminent demise as a good thing. I don't think you'll much like the world once my lords and masters remake it."
"So, how are you going to kill me?" Skulduggery asked, dropping his gun and holds his arms out. "With your toy? Or one of those new tricks you've learned?" Serpine smiled.
"I have been expending my repertoire, so good of you to notice."
"And I see you've been playing around with necromancy again."
"Indeed, my very own pet cleaver. Every home should have one."
"He's a tricky fellow to put down," Skulduggery said. "I tried everything I know. He just kept getting back up." Serpine laughed.
"There's an old necromancy saying, you can't kill what's already dead."
Skulduggery cocked his head. "He's a zombie?"
"Oh no, I wouldn't associate myself with those wretched things. He can repair, replenish, heal. A difficult process to master, but I am nothing if not accomplished."
"Of course," Skulduggery said, something new in his voice. "The medical equipment in the warehouse. The cleaver was a test run to see if the process worked. Then you did it to yourself."
"Ah, the great detective finally figures something out."
"Bells and whistles aside, Nefarian. He's nothing but a zombie, and so are you." Serpine shook his head.
"Your last words are pathetic. Insults? I was hoping for more. Something profound, perhaps maybe a poem."
He raised the scepter.
"It will be slightly less strange world without you. I just want you to know that."
Stephanie screamed his name as Skulduggery dived. Serpine laughed, and the scepter sent out its bolt of black lightning, but Skulduggery had seized the book of names and held it as a shield. The black lightning hit the book, and it disappeared into a cloud of dust.
"No!"
Serpine screamed.
"No!"
Stephanie stared as the book that the elders couldn't destroy sifted through Skulduggery's fingers. He charged through the cloud, slamming into Serpine. The scepter fell and rolled away. Serpine's hands closed around Skulduggery's neck, forcing his head back.
"You ruined it!"
he hissed.
"You ruined it all! You pathetic creature!"
Skulduggery slammed his fist into Serpine's face and battered the hands away. He stepped in with a jab that rocked the sorcerer's head. Serpine blasted Skulduggery with purple vapor, and Skulduggery was flung off his feet. He landed on his side and rolled, coming up to his knees as Serpine whipped a tendril out for the scepter. It sped towards him, but Skulduggery pushed outwards in the air, breaking the tendril and knocking the scepter off course. Skulduggery gathered flame in his hand and threw it at Serpine, who barely managed to deflect it. It exploded on the wall behind him, and Serpine hissed again, stumbling away before being launched backwards as the air rippled around him. He hit the wall and stayed there, high off the ground, held up by Skulduggery's outstretched hand from across the room.
"I'll destroy you,"
he snarled, his emerald eyes blazing with hatred.
"I destroyed you once. I will do it again."
He struggled to raise his right hand. Skulduggery pressed against him hard, drawing on his last reserves, but Serpine refused to be beaten. The fingers of his red hand pointed at Skulduggery.
"Die,"
Serpine whispered. Skulduggery inclined his head a little to the right and didn't fall. Serpine's face contorted with rage.
"Die,"
he screamed. Skulduggery remained standing. "Looks like there's something that hand of yours can't kill after all." A figure moved in the doorway. Serpine's laugh was one of spittle and gritted teeth as the white cleaver appeared.
"So you have an immunity to my power. No matter. That scythe of his will sear through your bones. You'll be nothing but rubble when he's through with you. Cleaver, attack!"
But the cleaver stayed where he was, and Serpine's confidence started to ebb.
"What are you doing? Kill him!"
The white cleaver took another moment, and then walked away. Serpine screamed his rage. "You've lost, Nefarian," Skulduggery said. "Even your henchman is abandoning you. Even he recognizes your defeat. I'm placing you under arrest for murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and, possibly littering." Serpine spat.
"You'll never beat me. I will always find a way to make you suffer."
And then his green eyes flickered towards Stephanie, still lying on the ground. "Don't!" Skulduggery said, but Serpine was already moving his hand across his body. "Serpine, don't!" Stephanie cried out as a pain more intense than anything she had ever felt scourged her body. Serpine twisted his fingers and the pain intensified, turning her cry into a scream, turning the scream to silent agony. She curled up, feeling something cold spread from her belly, a welcome numbness that canceled the pain, that moved into her arms and legs, that wrapped itself around her heart and seeped into her mind. And now there was nothing. Now there were just vague images of Serpine and Skulduggery, a distant voice, Skulduggery calling out to her, but that too was fading. No pain now, no sound. Her eyelids fluttered, Serpine with that grin, Skulduggery holding his free hand out and something moving through the air, everything moving so slow. The scepter. It was the scepter. And then it was in Skulduggery's gloved hand, and his fingers were tightening around it. He was raising his arm and pointing the scepter at Serpine, and the little crystal started to glow. It glowed dark, a pretty little darkness, and then the air cracked. Coldness had overtaken her now. The numbness was everywhere, and the last bits that had her who she was were gradually drifting away. She didn't care. She didn't mind at all. Let them go. She didn't have a care in the world. Serpine's grinning face, his eyes, his smile, all those teeth, his skin, creased in savage pleasure. And now that skin was changing. It was drying, and it was cracking, and the smile was fading. And the emerald green eyes were losing their gleam, clouding over. And Serpine turned to dust that fell to the floor. There was a ringing in her ears, and her fingertips were tingling, and warmth was rushing back to her, and her heart was beating again, and her lungs sucked in air, and Stephanie gasped. Skulduggery ran over and kneeled beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked, but all she could do was shiver. Her leg twisted and she hissed in pain, but it was a bearable pain. It was a good pain. "Come on," Skulduggery said, taking her arm gently. "Let's get you out of here." She put her weight on him, and he half carried her, half lifted her out of the chamber and into the corridor. They passed the gallows as the door opened and Tanith toppled out. She hit the ground and groaned. Stephanie looked down at her friend, at all the blood. Tanith raised her head. "Oh, good," she muttered. "You're alive." Skulduggery reached for her, pulling her carefully to her feet, and with an arm around each, he guided them both to the foyer. They climbed the stairs slowly and moved through the waxworks. The rain had stopped and the ground was wet as they emerged into the night. China Sorrows was standing beside her car, waiting for them. When they were close enough to Stephanie, so Stephanie could see the delicate earrings China was wearing, she spoke. "You've all seen better days." Could have used your help," Skulduggery said as they came to a stop. China shrugged her slender shoulders. "I knew you could do it without me. I had faith. Serpine?" "Dust," Skulduggery said. "Too many plans, too many schemes. Sooner or later they'd cancel each other out. That was always his problem." "How did you manage it?" "He wanted immortality, so he chose death on his own terms. A living death." China smiled. "Aha! And because the scepter can only be wielded when its previous owner is dead, or in this case, when its owner is the living dead, I took it and used it on him." He held up the scepter. "Something happened, though. There's no power in it anymore." China took it from him, turning it over in her hands. "It was fueled by hate. Obviously, using it against him made it feed on itself. Congratulations, Skulduggery. You've managed to break the ultimate weapon. It's nothing but an ornament now." "An ornament I'd like back," he said, holding out his hand. She smiled, turning her head slightly to look at him out of the corner of her eye. "I'll buy it from you," she said. "Why would you want it?" he asked. "It's worthless." "Sentimental reasons. Besides, you know what an avid collector I am." He sighed. "Fine, take it." There was that smile again. "Thank you. Oh, and the book?" "Destroyed." "How very like you to destroy the indestructible. You have quite an appetite for destruction, don't you?" "China, these bones are wary." "Then I shall leave you." "Bliss is still in there," Stephanie said. "I think he was working against Serpine the whole time. I don't know if he's alive, though." "That brother of mine is quite resilient. I've tried to kill him 3 times already, and he just won't stay down." China got into her car, looked at them through the open window. "Oh, by the way, all 3 of you, congratulations on saving the world." She gave them a beautiful smile, and they watched her drive off. They stood there for a while. The sky was beginning to brighten, the first rays of morning sun seeping into the black. "You know," Tana said weakly, "I still have a gigantic hole in my back." "Sorry," Skulduggery said, and helped them both towards the Bentley. And that... yeah, that's where we're going to end for now. I'm hitting buttons on things I don't mean to. But that's where we'll end it for now. Chapter 30 of Skulduggery Pleasant, or the first book of Skulduggery Pleasant, isn't really that long, but it'll be a good closure for next week, since it's the last Friday of the month. And we'll begin April with the ending chapter. So they defeated Serpine. Skulduggery managed to both destroy the Book of Names, which now no one can control anyone with their real name anymore, so that's good. But he managed to break the scepter, which renders it useless, but China still wants it. So there's no telling why she wants it, but it can't be for anything good. But we're almost at the end of the book. So thank you guys so much for listening to this one. If you liked it, you know what to do. Keep things crazy, and I'll see you guys in the next one.